All
You
right,
got it,
very
G.
good. Okay. Good evening, everybody.
Good
Thank you
evening.
for yeah, attending tonight's meeting. You know, we do have competition between the World's Fair and ERA.
Or on.
You know,
World Series.
World Series.
yep.
Oh, ERA met last week. That's the good news.
Last week, well, there are other something else going, but I know the World Series is definitely the chief, draw from this meeting. So, in any case, all right, I would like to start on a somber note. On October 9th, elsewhere in the state, on Long Island, excuse me, we lost a very valuable rail fan. He was my equivalent over at the LISD, Steve Quigley. I've known him from years. Paul, Steve, and a number of other people have known him. A great guy, fantastic rail organizer, etc., etc. He just died suddenly of a massive heart attack. We had the memorial meeting for LISD last week. So, for a few seconds, I would like to have a moment of silence.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. One small but very important thing that is going to be coming up in the future. On December 14th, on one of Mike Vidiello's video programs up at the library, we are going to hold the annual meeting. And Gigi knows about this because I sent him the meeting notice that will be on the e-bulletin version and on the hard copy version. So we're going to be electing a slate of officers. There is one glaring omission, which that is the office of secretary. Our friend Larry Penner has told me he's because of his condition, I won't get into it. He's physically incapable of carrying on. So I have just reassigned him as a regular director. So, we are finding a way around that. So we will be making up, I will make up the ballots and everybody will get to know about this. There will be instructions in the bulletin how to sign up for it. So
yes,
that's very, very simply that. So some of the topics that are in the bulletin, I'll just very briefly touch on one that's close to me, and that's so far there is one set of R211s which is operating out of Clifton Yard here on Staten Island. You'll get to read more about it on once I see my president's notes, but basically it was the train out of St. George was Jano Liba and other members of the MTA board, were going southbound from St. George. Originally, I thought it was just Great Kills. The sign did say Tottenville. Whether they got all the way to Tottenville is anybody's guess. So, okay, so small thing on the Long Island Railroad, there's additional trains running on certain lines, like the Lonkonkoma lines, which is an improvement. So it benefits a whole lot of people, at least on that particular line. I don't really have anything more to say. I'm going to turn this all over to Paul, who will pick it up from here. Paul?
Okay. Thank you, Sheldon.
Mhm.
Once again, I want to welcome everyone to the October meeting of the New York Railroad Enthusiasts. Tonight, we will have a first-time presenter in the guise of David Alff, and will be in his very good hands. I'll be describing in further detail on that program. And now just looking ahead, next month will be a rarity. The fourth Friday of the month, November 22nd, will not conflict with the Thanksgiving Day weekend, which is a great rarity for those familiar with our normal November schedule. And we'll be in the, we'll have a speaker we all look forward to every year, Mr. Andrew Grau. He's put together a very interesting agenda for us, a digital slideshow, both contemporary and historical, covering a number of very interesting subject matters. So that will be next month, fourth Friday, November 22nd. And believe it or not, will not conflict with the Thanksgiving Day weekend, which starts a week later this year. Now, going ahead to the fourth Friday of December, December 27th, another break. Many years in December, as we all know, we have to move our meeting because it conflicts with either Christmas Eve Day or Christmas Day, whatever the case may be. That will not be necessary this year because it'll fall on the 27th, which I don't think is a problem for me. And we'll have Cora Soa putting on a program of highlighting the best of rail fanning in the Hawkeye state of Iowa, which I know has an excellent interurban museum. I think Crandick is the name of it, and some other highlights. So we'll be looking forward to that. And if I may go ahead to the first program of 2025, Sheldon made reference to the Staten Island Railway. Well, I guess that will be our subject matter on Friday, January 24th. We'll have a historical DVD based on the work of the late Gary Grau, Andrew's father, and it's a compilation of his Super 8 films that he compiled while rail fanning on Staten Island, namely the SIR, over those many years. I don't think it covers any of the historical lines like the South Shore line or the North Shore, but will definitely be covered from St. George to Tottenville. So be on hand for another program of local subject matter for those of you that requested. That brings me to tonight, where Mr. David Alff will bring us on board for the Northeast Corridor, the New York Metro, specifically the New York metropolitan area portion. David teaches in the English department at SUNY Buffalo. This talk will draw on research from his new book, The Northeast Corridor, The Trains, the People, the History, the Region. David has written about infrastructure and transportation for Time Magazine, the Washington Post, the Boston Review, and various academic journals. So this will bring a unique and comprehensive view of a historic rail corridor. So once again, month after month, year after year, the Railroad Enthusiast brings you the very best in rail fan entertainment. And tonight will certainly be no exception in the guise of Mr. David Alff. And without further ado, let me yield the floor to David. Take it away.
Thank you, Paul and Stephen, for inviting me to talk tonight. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope I can
You're welcome.
begin to live up to that introduction. I'm going to talk for about an hour with slides and then open things up to question and answer and discussion. Speaking of slides, before I get into it too much, I just want to make sure, can you see the slides that I'm
Yes.
sharing right now? And they're full size and everything?
Yes, the title page, yes, New York's corridor, NYRRE, 1025, David Alff.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. All right, let me move some things around. Okay, so I live in New York, as we were talking beforehand. Not New York City, but New York State. At the far end of the thruway, at the last lock of the Erie Canal, at the second to last stop on Amtrak's Empire Service, in the Rust Belt border town of Buffalo. I live in Buffalo, but come from the eastern seaboard, specifically the suburbs outside Philadelphia. Growing up in Bucks County, we used to watch trains rush through Croydon, Pennsylvania. It was the 80s. I remember SEPTA Silverliners pulsing by, some bearing the faded logo of their former operator, the Penn Central. I remember Amtrak's AEM 7s, so boxy and Swedish, towing their columns of Amfleet coaches. I learned about these trains and others from my grandfather, Richard Delaney of Spuyten Duyvil, who was a prolific rail fan, son-in-law of a Long Island Railroad engineer, my great-grandfather. My 9-year-old daughter, Mira, has inherited our family's fascination with trains. It's in her blood. Mira knows which whistles go with freight and which belong to Amtrak. She knows that the arrival of the Toronto-bound Maple Leaf at Exchange Street signals the end of her school day. Like me, Mira's happy to pack a lunch and hit the platforms at Depew with a sketch pad or notebook. Unlike me, she has a perfect knack for color coordination. When I moved from Philadelphia to Buffalo in 2012 to take the position in the English department, I became starkly aware of being from the Northeast. I felt it in my patterns of speech, my pace walking sidewalks, my allergy to driving. And I realized that a big part of what I missed about home were its trains. There were so many of them that I rode, and even more that I saw at Croydon and later heard from my apartment in downtown Philly. I miss the sizzle of catenary, pungency of creosote, the cherry almond scent of Amtrak soap, the fake oak interiors of New Jersey Transit's Arrow MU coaches. I miss the coming and going and that feeling of being looped into something beyond my home. I miss the look of 30th Street Station in winter sunlight and the smell of Trenton's track bed after spring rain. And so in Buffalo, during the lonely depths of the pandemic, a time when few of us were going anywhere, I researched and wrote a book about a railroad and the places it connects, including the place that I'm from. I wrote specifically about the tracks that solder Boston to Providence, New Haven, New York, Trenton, Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore, Washington, and points between, and how these tracks become or became what we now call the Northeast Corridor. The Northeast Corridor, as I'm sure you all know, is the busiest and fastest intercity passenger rail line in North America. Corridor trains carry some 800,000 riders a day, a headcount greater than the populations of Seattle, Denver, and San Francisco. Trains deliver those people to hundreds of thousands of jobs, including 1/3 of Fortune 100 firms, 263 colleges within 5 miles of a station, and over 30% of civilization's most visited museums. The line links one of the world's most powerful financial centers to its most consequential political capital. Economists estimate that closing the corridor for a single day would sacrifice $100 million worth of labor to gridlock. The line enables 17% of the country's population to live on less than 2% of its land. The corridor is a gift from history and a tool for survival. While testifying before Congress, Temple University President John Fry called it America's greatest transportation asset. So great is this asset that the word corridor has grown synonymous with its region. People do not simply ride the corridor, but live there too. Once home to tens of thousands of Algonquins, this coastal band between Virginia and Massachusetts became a beachfront for colonial conquest, for colonial settlement, a testbed for the Industrial Revolution, a fiscal laboratory, source of global policy, and a new order of space that the Ukrainian geographer Gene Gottman called megalopolis. Like Rust Belt, Deep South, Silicon Valley, and Appalachia, corridor has become shorthand for what many think of as the region's defining features: its brisk pace of life, its diversity, comparative affluence. But as I show in my book, that's not even half the story. As any passenger can tell you, the corridor races through forests and along shorelines, past weedy lots like this one in Bridgeport, and chemical plants, through villages and cities and marsh. Yes, Manhattan, but also Saybrook. Washington, sure, but don't forget Cornwall Heights, Mystic, and the rest. My belief that you can learn so much more about the region from gazing out a coach window than from reading editorials or magazine pieces. But there's also a lot that we can't know from simply riding a train. There's so much that I didn't know or did not fully appreciate until I undertook the research to write this book. While today's corridor may feel like a single seamless piece of infrastructure, it's really a patchwork of many railroads whose names live on in archives. I doubt that many passengers of the 21st century have heard of the Boston and Providence, the Harlem River and Port Chester, the Camden and Amboy, the Philadelphia and Trenton, the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, and the Baltimore and Potomac, even as they coast over their former rights of way. And most of those ways are much older than the railroads they host. Some pieces of the corridor's route originated as colonial post routes that had previously been indigenous traces. In Metro Park, New Jersey, the busy tracks run beside Route 27, a segment of the first transcontinental highway that had previously been part of a royal road network commissioned by King Charles II of England in the 1670s. Before that, it had been a Dutch fur trader's route, and before that, the Lenape-Assunpink Trail. Today's trains follow a lot of footsteps along some deeply rutted ways. And that, I think, is what makes the corridor such a fascinating historical subject. The line was never a neat and tidy project, a Shinkansen bullet train, a TGV, or for that matter, an interstate highway. Rather, the line came together intermittently, over time, like a row of bushes that hedges together. For centuries, Maryland track gangs, Boston Brahmins, German swamp trainers, Irish baggage smashers, Mexican braceros had no idea that they were building something together, and that what they were building, the corridor, would outlive all of them. Today's corridor passengers blast over bridges raised when Andrew Jackson was president, careen around curves embanked by Civil War veterans, and plunge through tunnels older than the Titanic. Their fellow riders have at different points included Frederick Douglass, Albert Einstein, Duke Ellington, Chris Christie, Barack Obama, Leopold Stokowski, Marion Moore, King Charles II, my Phillies, your Mets, the Nationals, and so many more. New Haven Railroad rider George Gershwin recalled that, quote, "It was on the train with its steely rhythms, its rattle-tee-bang, that I suddenly heard Rhapsody in Blue from beginning to end." John Coltrane saw, heard, and most certainly felt those same percussive tracks, which ran right behind his Philadelphia row home at 1511 North 33rd Street. Today, the historic corridor is again a construction site where some of America's most ambitious and expensive infrastructural projects are coming to life. The new Frederick Douglass Tunnel that will burrow under the streets of Baltimore, a new Susquehanna River Bridge, a new Gateway Bridge over the Hackensack River in North Jersey, new tunnels under the Hudson River, and maybe even a reimagined Penn Station that would build upon the civic momentum behind Moynihan Train Hall. Given all this investment and all this attention, I think it's a good time to get to know what we have inherited. The corridor is a vital, sometimes vexing public work, always in the public eye, and a moment when many of us wonder whether the country's fraying quilt of roads, bridges, railroads, sewers, dams, and pipelines will hold together or collapse under the weight we put on them. A time when regional identity holds existential political weight. We need to know more about the corridor's past to understand where the line will lead us next. Tonight, I'm specifically going to talk about the 27 miles of corridor track that run through New York, from the Connecticut border to the center of the Hudson River Channel. That's only about 6% of the line, and yet I'm sure everyone here would agree that this segment holds outsized importance to the seaboard, to the nation, and the logistics that bind them to one another. These 27 miles include some of the corridor's most iconic structures and memorable stories, its busiest intercity passenger station, its largest coach yard, Hellgate Bridge, Cass Gilbert's abandoned jewel box stations in the Bronx, and an unmatched variety of carriers: Amtrak, NJT, LIRR, Metro North, CSX, Canadian Pacific, and the Providence and Worcester. All this variety means that New York plays an outsized role in my book, particularly the challenge of drawing trains into and through the country's largest city, a metropolis in which all but one borough sits on an island. My work on this chapter draws upon the research of historians and journalists whose books you probably know: Lorraine Deal's The Late Great Pennsylvania Station, Jill Jonas's Conquering Gotham, William Middleton's Manhattan Gateway, and Albert Chiarella's fabulous first volume of the Pennsylvania Railroad. With the exception of Chiarella, these authors are most interested in the river crossings and Pennsylvania Station. I'm interested in these feats as they tie together into the bigger story of the corridor, a story that I want to make available for the widest possible readership within the rail heritage and professional community and beyond. So, part 1, Ferry to Tunnel. In May 1909, the Pennsylvania Railroad issued an orange booklet filled with schedules for fast express trains between New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. Despite the timetable's title, none of these trains drew closer to New York than Jersey City. The tracks ended at Exchange Place Station on Paulus Hook, where Manhattan-bound passengers completed their journeys on ferries that plied the same busy Hudson River waters as Albany steamers, Cunard ocean liners, and the Cuba Mail. Riders traveling not to New York, but on to New England remained seated as their coaches rolled onto rails pinned to the decks of the steamboat Maryland. The Maryland served as a floating bridge between the PRR's Jersey Headland and the New Haven's South Bronx Terminal. The steamer had previously ferried passengers for the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad across the Susquehanna River. It was even impressed into service for the Union Army during the Civil War. Despite the Pennsylvania and New Haven Railroad's immense investments in their main lines in the late 19th and early 20th century, the last link between Washington and Boston remained a boat. On a December night in 1888, the Maryland chugged up the Harlem River. Fire broke out in one of the galley kitchens. The captain throttled toward Mott Haven, reaching the wharf as flames consumed the vessel. A conductor roused sleeping passengers as the double-decker ship began to sink. The next morning, sunrise revealed what the New York Times called a collapsed smokestack, some blackened stanchions, twisted iron, and 2 charred sides which rose from the Harlem River. The wreck of the Maryland underscored the need for a true rail link into and through New York. The Pennsylvania first consulted with Viennese engineer Gustav Lindenthal, who proposed a suspension bridge to carry trains between Castle Point Terrace and Canal Street. When the Army Corps of Engineers nixed this structure for fear that its 60-story anchor piers would block ship traffic, Lindenthal dreamt further crossings. One intended span from Hoboken to Chelsea received a groundbreaking ceremony in 1885 before financial panic scuttled the project. There's still a cornerstone of sorts, or a stone in the soil commemorating the groundbreaking for this bridge that was never built. While Lindenthal tried to lift trains through the sky, others envisioned burrowing under the river floor. The first person to imagine a submarine connection between New Jersey and Manhattan was Revolutionary War Colonel and steam traction pioneer John Stevens, who, if you'll believe it, in 1806 sketched plans to sink brick tubes to the bottom of the Hudson River. He would vacuum them out and then lay tracks so that trains could pass through. This is in the age before the War of 1812. The first practical attempt at an interstate bore came 73 years later, when the Hudson Tunnel Railroad Company tried to build what was essentially a subway tunnel to Jersey City. The Star-Cross project took decades, claimed 20 lives, but it endures. Path trains clatter through these tubes today. While the Pennsylvania Railroad pondered its own Manhattan entrance, two emerging technologies gave tunnels an edge over bridges. Hydraulic shields accelerated underground boring. These three-story metallic cylinders used jacks to push their lamprey-shaped mouths through sopping earth. Whenever the shield got stuck, workers opened muck chutes to let the silt plop into the tunnel like Play-Doh through a press. The development of shields roughly coincided with the maturation of electric traction, which could propel trains through enclosed spaces without suffocating passengers with coal smoke. The installation of direct current third rails on the London Underground in 1890, and here beneath Paris's Gare d'Orsay in 1900, proved that trains could operate underground. If anyone who's been to the Musée d'Orsay in France, you're looking at its earlier iteration as an electric rail terminal. It was against this backdrop that the Pennsylvania embarked on one of the most ambitious civil engineering projects in U.S. history, the Manhattan Improvements. These would consist of tunnels under the Hudson River, East River, and Midtown Manhattan, and the construction of Penn Station, Sunnyside Yard, and the Hellgate Bridge. For this vision, an enormous sum of credit goes to the PRR's intrepid leadership, and particularly to a cautious Pittsburgher named Alexander Cassatt. Here is Cassatt as painted by his equally talented sister, the Bohemian oil painter, Mary. First hired as a surveyor on the Georgia Railroad, Alexander Cassatt rose through the industry ranks until he received the Pensie's top job in 1899. Having studied at Germany's Darmstadt University and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Cassatt brought worldliness to the rough and tumble business of railroading. Learned but versatile, Alexander was as comfortable inspecting Altoona classification yards as he was strolling galleries in Berlin or walking the turf at Monmouth Downs, where his thoroughbreds raced. At the turn of the century, Cassatt wanted nothing more than to make the Pennsy the greatest railroad of all time, an ambition to which the coastal line, the future corridor, proved integral. Cassatt invested millions of dollars in what newspapers called the railroad's glittering steel pathway, constructing granite arch bridges over the Delaware and Raritan rivers, which remain in place today, and raising tracks over traffic on sandstone viaducts. Despite these vast public works, the Hudson River still loomed. Beyond it lay the biggest city in the country, and New England beyond that. On December 11th, 1901, Cassatt unveiled the Manhattan Improvements. These included a new branch between Newark and Weehawken over the Hackensack Meadows, and a new station, Manhattan Transfer, where steam locomotives would swap out for electric engines. These engines shuttled passengers over the meadows, through Bergen Hill, beneath Hoboken, under the Hudson River, then up through layers of glittery Manhattan schist. Trains would continue cross town through a subway cut, then enter another iron bore that pierced the East River's clay bed. The tracks would resurface in Queens, climb over Astoria, and though you can't see it in this fold-out map I found at the Hagley Library in Wilmington, they would cross the East River again, this time over the narrow Hellgate Strait, where the Long Island Sound dumps in, where the East River dumps into the Long Island Sound dumps into the East River, and then they would continue northeast toward their connection with the New Haven. In 1902, the PRR's baseline measuring corps scaled Bergen Hill. The 9 white men in starched shirts, suspenders, bow ties, bowlers, and fedoras gazed through their theodolites and penciled measurements. The North Jersey landscape that appeared through their lenses remained rugged. This is the backside of Bergen Hill through which trains rush today, and you can look out at the meadows, which seem to stretch on infinitely. To their east were the Erie Railroad stockyards, a parquet of boxcars, a sepia band of river, and Manhattan's first skyscrapers thrusting through the gauze. In this July photograph, core members grin and smirk. They project confidence in themselves and their instruments and the grand design of the Manhattan improvements that brought them up into the Palisades. But the men who actually built the tunnels and laid the tracks enjoyed none of this tranquility. Italian, Slavic, Irish, and African Americans toiled in muck-covered boots, sweaty skin glinting under light bulbs dangling from cords looped over crossbeams. Camera flashes turned their eyes into white coins. Long exposures made their bodies a blur of gross motor movement. One worker lifts a massive iron wrench, another clutches a pipe, another hunches over a spade. One stands beside an excavation car that seems almost glued to its tracks. As the periodical Scientific American cheerfully put it, the Manhattan improvements required 1,000 tons of iron and steel, a quarter million barrels of cement, and the quote, energy and enthusiasm of hundreds of laborers who acquired the nickname sandhogs. Even with hydraulic shields, train tunneling remained hazardous work. Diggers found that the drone of compression engines and the buzz of nitrogenated blood dulled their concentration, an effect that PRR managers addressed by serving free coffee. No one knew when the shield might puncture a pocket of quicksand or when the compressors would conk out. In June 1906, a tunnel blowout made the East River foam like a geyser. And of all the photographs I've come across in different archives, this was one of the most startling to me, that somebody had the wherewithal to take a photograph of a moment when air was escaping from the tunnel and bubbling up by a dock in the East River. In November 1906, the, quote, bravest of tunnel men, African-American New Yorker Lee Stribling, drowned under a torrent of liquefied sand. In Manhattan, Austrian tunnelers who had braved the Alps grappled with a rhizomatic mess of pipes and ducts and foundations. In December, they cut into a long-forgotten underground stream and opened a sinkhole on 33rd Street that swallowed a trash truck. But 22 years after the steamer Maryland sunk in the Harlem River, Pennsylvania trains rolled through the underworld between New Jersey and Queens. The tunnels were, as Scientific American put it, a permanent monument to the mastery of science over the greatest barriers in nature. It was also a memorial to those who drowned in seawater and writhed from the bends. Their achievement, strangely, vanished into the darkness it opened. The dim sameness of tunnel riding made it hard for passengers to contemplate what had been done for them. Few gave thought to the flounder wriggling over their heads, the crabs clattering over rocks, perhaps not even the pressure building in their eardrums. As the writer E.B. White of Charlotte's Web and Elements of Style put it, the typical rider, quote, calmly plays bridge while buried in mud at the bottom of the East River. This is something I try to think about anytime I take a train into or through New York, is just to think about all the labor that went into doing it. And it's kind of hard because it's just dark when you're in a tunnel. There's kind of nothing to notice or observe, but I try not to kind of take for granted the ease with which I can move into and out of the city. Okay, part 2, Tenderloin to Terminal. In Manhattan, the Pennsylvania Railroad tunneled under a midtown slum of laundry-lined tenements and triple-decker brownstones, Saturday matinees, Sunday morning masses, all-night dance parties, and backroom poker games. Bakers, butchers, and pastors shared blocks with pimps, hustlers, and cut purses. Legend holds that the district took its name from the readiness of Tammany cops to overlook Satan's circus for bribes. Upon his promotion to the precinct, Captain Alexander Clubber Williams quipped that he had spent his whole life eating ground chuck or some other cheap cut of meat in the tale's infinite retellings, but thanks to his new powers of extortion, he would eat tenderloin. So that became the name of the neighborhood, according to that legend. The Tenderloin bristled with activity, with violence, until 1902, when it burned out like a broken light bulb. Overnight, it seemed, the burlesque became a dead zone. There is a deserted village in the heart of the borough of Manhattan, proclaimed the New York Times. There is the silence which marks the streets of a city devastated by war or pestilence. The desertion of the Tenderloin that felt so sudden had actually begun a year earlier, when agents from a mysterious holding company canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and offering residents cash for their homes. No one had ever heard of the Stuyvesant Real Estate Company, though its allusion to New York's Dutch origins had a kind of generic ring to it, enough to seem like it had always been there. Enough that few questioned why its agents were buying up the neighborhood and for whom. The deserted village stood until 1903, when wrecking crews reduced the Tenderloin to brick shards and grout. A few tree trunks held out, as did some fence palings and a bar that you can see the upper right-hand corner, which Hilary Ballin argues was temporarily preserved so that rec crews would have a place to drink when they got off their shifts. At the western edge of the three-block void, trains darted over the Interborough Rapid Transit Company's elevated railway. At the eastern edge, shown the Red Star logo of the new dry goods emporium, Macy's, which you can see in the upper left-hand there. The ruinous prairie then became a pit, an excavation of sparkling mica schist, so yawning and massive and deep that people likened it to the biggest hole they could imagine, the unfinished Panama Canal. There are all sorts of newspaper articles that refer to the Midtown excavation as the Panama Canal of New York. From this crater came the bright clang of metal on rock and the click-clacking of miner hoppers shunting spoils over trestles. Voices echoed up from the bottom. Ashcan artist George Bellows pitched an easel beside the hole and painted it 4 times. His most sublime composition, the one that I've shown here, captures the work on a winter night. Lamps shine against ice-caked rock, orange flames quiver deep within the crevice like ladled steel. Candlelight burns dismally from the windows of a pit-side tenement. The hole expelled dust and smoke over the streets of Manhattan, and sometimes solid matter. In November 1904, a dislodged gneiss fragment shattered the window of Joanna Verstein's candy store. Another shard of bedrock entered Joseph Lonzo's seafood shop, crushed a plate of fried crabs, and sent Mr. Lonzo scampering beneath, quote, fish and pans and grease. Another stone smashed the Macy's toy department window display, nearly decapitating a window washer. Yet another errant blast rained rock down on Erlin Bell's saloon, rupturing a jug of, in his words, very old port wine. When the blasting stopped, masons lined the pit with concrete. Steel beams stretched from each side like yard on a loom. Bar by bar, a corrugated skeleton rose over the base, a modest 5 stories on 7th Avenue that vaulted skyward at 8th. Wind whistled through the frame. 1,100 gondolas of Milford granite arrived from Massachusetts and were snapped into place. The sheets sparkled pink with potash salts, lime feldspar, and quartz. The finished hall had the brooding air of a public library or science museum. Its stony sobriety seemed like penance for the Tenderloin sin circus. At this point, I should reiterate that I was born in 1982, and so have absolutely no memories of the original Penn Station. So I've tried to salvage the experience of it as best I can from blueprints, letters, poems, photographs, and other articles of the archives. I'd love to hear your stories, especially those who've actually passed through the halls. One, I imagine, would have felt their smallness, passing through the 7th Avenue colonnade, decked with granite eagles, marble goddesses, and a Roman numeral clock. To enter was to descend into what Langston Hughes called a vast basilica of old. Pennsylvania Station plunged travelers 4 stories into the earth. Stairs dropped from the street level to a foyer of Corinthian columns, an allusion to Jupiter's temples, and a testament to the hidden steel holding all this classicism aloft. So Penn Station looked like this work of classical architecture, but underneath it were much more modern construction techniques, and specifically the steel beams that were holding it together. An arcade lined with florists, tobacconists, and soda fountains led to more stairs, which descended to another room decked in marble, travertine, and concrete that was mixed to look like travertine. Lamps sprouted from the floor, their globular bulbs like glowing fruit. Semicircle windows gave the polished chamber a mellow tone. An alcove from one wall contained a ghost, a bronze statue of Alexander Cassatt in buttoned topcoat and bow tie, clutching a bowler hat and cane. In 1905, PRR Assistant Chief Engineer Joseph Richards worried that the president was poring over terminal plans when he was, if you can read this letter, on his vacation at Bar Harbor and supposed to be resting. This scribbled note was one of the most haunting finds at the Hagley. It's a subordinate telling his boss to take a break because you have a heart condition and sickness. And of course, by 1907, Cassatt was dead of heart failure. A placard, now in Penn Station, honored the man whose, quote, foresight, courage, and ability achieved the extension of the Pennsylvania Railroad system into New York City, but who never got to see it. He was a Moses who never reached the Holy Land. Behind a final set of doors, the Roman bath gave way to a greenhouse that scissored the sky into ovaloid swaths. The stone station turned crystalline. A final staircase brought passengers to the pit floor. Here, about 45 feet beneath the trolleys and milk trucks and hawkers and pickpockets of street-level Manhattan, gleamed train tracks. Over these tracks lisped electric trains. They came and went through the tunnels that howled like elevator shafts. Through the west portal was the Hudson's Sylph Bed, the Jersey Meadows, Philadelphia, Washington, Chicago, California. Through the east shaft lay Long Island and everything else. Part 3. Sunnyside and the Gates of Hell. If Pennsylvania was a shimmering granite poem, then Queens was where the terminal zone showed its scratchwork. Trains leaving Midtown rolled under the East River to Long Island City, where they surfaced in a former Huguenot farm. Turn-of-the-century photographs depict Sunnyside Hill as a dust bowl of shotgun shacks and cow pasture. On a meadow 4,000 feet from Manhattan, PRR engineers scooped another pit. In it, they lay 53 miles of track in 45 rows that fanned off the main line like veins of a palm frond. Crews installed repair shops, inspection offices, commissaries, lavatories, smith sheds, and signal cabins. Sunnyside Hill became Earth's largest coachyard. From a passing train, Sunnyside Yard surpassed all comprehension, like someone had shaken out the contents of 1 million model railroad kits. The yard employed PRR mechanics as well as Pullman personnel who scrubbed windows, hosed down wheel wells, restocked dining cars, and heaved ice slabs into air conditioner bays. An 8-woman team of bedding inspectors cleansed 110,000 pieces of linen every 24 hours. Their storeroom was nicknamed Widow's Haven, according to the Pullman Company's employee newsletter, which marveled that all but 2 of the 25 women had survived their husbands and have on them 64 children dependent, more than the ordinary complement of a country schoolhouse. Queens filled in around the yard like a healing wound. Borough residents moved to courtyard apartments and shaded townhouses close to rail work. A model community, Sunnyside Gardens, sprouted south of the tracks. Social critic and Sunnyside resident Louis Mumford championed his Greenbelt neighborhood, which became known as the maternity ward of Greenwich Village. Manufacturers clustered north of the tracks around freight access. The placards of Sunshine Biscuits, Swingline Staples, Steinway Piano, and Chiclets Chewing Gum rose over the yard. Trains bound for New England swung past Sunnyside on the New York Connecting Railroad, which fused the tracks of the Pennsylvania to those of the New Haven. The railbed climbed over Astoria's backyards on rusting girders and ivy-bearded concrete to the edge of Queens, where they met the tidal strait that 17th century Dutch trader Adrian Block called Hellegat, or Hellgate. The PRR hired Gustav Lindenthal to build a bridge across the Hellgate, a kind of consolation prize for the Hudson spans he never finished. Lindenthal worked with Philadelphia engineer Alfred Pancoast Baller, who had designed a graceful and pleasing Whipple-double intersection truss swing bridge over Connecticut's Thames River. For Hellgate, Bowler conceived a dramatic cantilever bow stretching between granite turrets on each riverbank. Hellgate Bridge slapped an elegant signature on the unified corridor. The iconic epoxy red arch publicized the new one-seat ride from Yankeedom to the Chesapeake. It was, I think, the Northeast Corridor's closest thing to a golden spike. To complete Bowler's arch, Lindenthal recruited bridge builders who were unfazed by heights. Among those who came to Queens was an iron worker from Quebec's Kanawaki Reservation named John Diabo. Diabo worked as a bucker-up, capping rivets for an Irish gang whose foreman called him Indian Joe. Other Canadian Haudenosaunee joined Diabo until there were enough men to form an all-indigenous crew. At night, they came down from the bridge and slept in a section of Boerum Hill, Brooklyn, which they called downtown Kanawaki. Centuries after Lenape were driven from the original residents of Manhattan, the Lenape were driven to Ontario, Wisconsin, Kansas, and Oklahoma, the so-called Mohawk Skywalkers entranced Northeasterners. Haudenosaunee riveters, sheeters, heaters, and buckers up worked not just on Hellgate Bridge, but on Rockefeller Center, the George Washington Bridge. One journalist referred to the West Side Highway and New Jersey's Pulaski Skyway as modern Iroquois trails in recognition of their builders. Diabo, however, saw little of the phenomenon he launched. One day, while working on the Hellgate scaffold, he stepped into the air and plunged into the East River. No one could explain his death. A crew member speculated that, quote, it must have been one of those cases he got in the way of himself. On April Fool's Day, 1917, the Pennsylvania Railroad's Federal Express steamed out of Washington toward New Jersey. The train paused on the Passaic Flats to change engines at Manhattan Transfer. Hitched to an electric engine, the Federal shot across the new Hackensack cutoff through the North River tunnels and arrived at Penn Station after midnight. 5 minutes later, it slipped under the East River, past Sunnyside Yard, and ascended over sleeping Queens. Around 1 in the morning, the Federal crossed the dark turbulence of Hellgate and merged with the New Haven's tracks to Boston. A few minutes later, a Washington-bound train crossed the same track heading south. After 84 years, the Great Chain had become an unbroken ride. The corridor was, in a certain sense, complete. Part 4, Into Ruin. By the mid-20th century, Northeasterners were abandoning urban cores and temperamental trains. Downtown terminals like Boston's South Station, Washington's Union Station, and Philadelphia's Broad Street Station began to seem ludicrously overbuilt. Manhattan's low-slung Penn Station committed the mortal sin of leaving the sky above it untouched. 9 acres of unused real estate that would grow ever more conspicuous as Midtown grew up around them. The station's interior, meanwhile, grew shabby and confused. The granite lost its sparkle. The greenhouse, excuse me, the greenhouse dimmed from grime and wartime blackout paint. Efforts to modernize the somber hall backfired in what Sunnyside resident Louis Mumford called a symposium of errors. These errors included a sacrilegious digital clock, some tacky kiosks, cars on pedestals, and a scalloped airport-style ticket counter made of formica, steel, and fluorescent plastic that is known infamously as Lester Ticci's clamshell, which you can see on the right. No one entering Penn Station for the first time without clairvoyance could imagine how good it used to be, Mumford stewed. Of course, one could still squint past the ill-conceived updates and penny ante profiteering to imagine Penn Station as a gateway to the world. Fidel Castro, jet black beard, olive shirt, brass buttons and all, sauntered through the waiting room in April 1959, thronged by Cuban-American supporters. Here he is standing beside a New Haven train, which is one of the more surreal photographs I came across in the archives. That same fall, a beaming Nikita Khrushchev passed through Penn Station from a chartered train to the United Nations, the time he rapped a loafer against his desk. But no amount of ceremony could stem the tidal pull of Manhattan property markets, and no one could any longer ignore the developable air above Penn Station's faux classical hall. There were no shortage of schemes for the site. In 1954, real estate developer William Zeckendorf proposed replacing Penn Station with a palace of progress containing a textile mart, a World Trade Center, and a permanent World's Fair. When engineers deemed the palace architecturally unsound, Zeckendorf proposed an even vaster atomic city that would include a 1,750-foot tall Freedom Tower. So kind of bizarrely, 34th Street was imagined as Manhattan's first World Trade Center and first Freedom Tower decades before Minoru Yamasaki's Twin Towers ascended over the Battery. I think about the current raft of schemes for leveling Madison Square Garden, building a new railroad, and it just seems like when it comes to the Garment District in this part of Manhattan, it's always the object of imagination and dreaming for so many different forms of projects. So brazenly ultra-modern were Zeckendorf's ideas that when Irving Felt proposed Penn Station as the site of a new Madison Square Garden, the idea carried some comfort of tradition. The name Madison Square Garden had floated around Manhattan ever since P.T. Barnum raced Shetland ponies driven by monkeys in a hippodrome over the ruins of the Harlem Railroad's Madison Avenue Depot, which is shown here. That was the first Madison Square Garden, also built on top of a level train station. A second Madison Square Garden by architect Stanford White, who would go on to co-design Penn Station, evoked the Cathedral of Seville with a soaring minaret. The third garden opened north of Times Square, where it creaked under the weight of cigar-smoking crowds cheering on the Knicks, Rangers, Billy Graham, and Sugar Ray Robinson. A fourth Madison Square Garden, Felt hoped, would grow from the rubble of Penn Station. The arena scheme outraged architects and antiquarians who marched along 7th Avenue in August 1962, their suits, scarves, and pearls crisp against Penn Station's blackened facade. The picketers included Jane Jacobs, whose recent polemic, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, had attacked the kind of academic groupthink that foisted renewal projects on top of cities and their residents. Jacobs joined other members of the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York, AGBANY. They toted around signs that said things like, be a pen pal, renovate, don't amputate. They buttonholed passengers with petitions and otherwise made a polite ruckus on 7th Avenue. Penn Station, they claimed, was not a glaring anachronism or an impediment to progress. It was New York's birthright. Despite their efforts, and despite a last-minute attempt to persuade the Port Authority to purchase Penn Station and nurse it back to health, the building's fate was sealed. In October 1963, the Loria Brothers Company arrived on 7th Avenue for what they called just another job. Its workers pried apart Penn Station with sledges and jackhammers. They unwrapped the steel beams that bore the travertine walls. They crated off the marble statues and granite eagles. Madison Square Garden grew within the rubble like a creature cracking through an egg. Passengers watched from the inside out through dust clouds and welding sparks until drop cloths censored the carnage like an offstage murder. By the time wrecking balls pummeled what remained of the hall, riders were encased by a concrete floor. They navigated the same concourse as always, but they now looked up at styrofoam. In February 1968, the project was complete. That night, Bob Hope looked out at 19,000 faces from the center of a boxing ring. It's a wonderful thing to be here for the opening of Astrodome East, he quipped. Isn't this a beautiful sight and a beautiful ceiling? Hope gestured to the beige sound dampeners suspended overhead and to the lighting ring that shone like a diamond tiara. NBC's cameras followed Hope's cues, alighting on every angle and surface of Madison Square Garden, the 4th. The arena looked that much sharper for its state-of-the-art air filtration system, which sucked up cigar smoke. Hope shambled across the canvas ring on the inaugural night of Madison Square Garden, the same ring where he would later box Rocky Marciano, or pretend to. Hope reeled off one-liners about senators and tow-away zones, Mayor Lindsay and the garbage strike, before he spun around on his wingtip shoes and said, I'm going to tell you one thing. They sure have a crazy set of trains in the basement. A second passed before spectators caught it. Laughter, which you can hear on the video, which is on YouTube, rumbled through the audience. Mirth and sorrow mingled in the smokeless air. New Yorkers who had come to christen the 4th Madison Square Garden with a man named Hope now remembered what they had shoved to the basement. The old comedian felt that melancholy and led others to it. This place is built over the Pennsylvania station, and I wish they told me, Hope continued, though he knew the terminal well, having once mugged for a publicity opportunity from the cab of a GG1 engine. This morning, Hope said, I walked into the wrong dressing room and wound up in Jersey City. The crowd laughed again, this time from their stomach pits. Hope beamed. His joke landed on the miraculous power of train stations to put people elsewhere. Penn Station still performed this daily magic, even in labyrinthine form, even under the gloomy slant letters of the Penn Central. Most of the station was now itself elsewhere, strewn across a tract of Jersey meadow at 2800 Secaucus Road. Fractured columns, marbled torsos, and granite rubble bleached in the sun beside the corridor tracks. This is Eddie Hausner's iconic 1968 image for the New York Times. Riders saw these relics as their trains raced in and out of Manhattan's New Garden. The stone sat there for years. The owners of 2800 Secaucus Road planned to use it to harden marsh beneath a planned industrial park. The hallowed rock of Penn Station seemed destined to return to the earth from which Italians and New Englanders had quarried it a century earlier. When asked whether it was appropriate to use Penn Station as infill, Demolition Chief Morris Lipset shot back, if anybody seriously considered art, they would have put up some money to save it. Part 5, Reborn Again. I wasn't around to see the destruction of Penn Station, much less its birth, but I do remember 3 years ago. On the first morning of 2021, New Yorkers got to enter the mailroom. The Farley sorting office had sat for so long behind brass-barred counter windows. Only postal workers knew its belts and ducks, its stamp gum air, and the flutter of envelopes dropping through chutes. The mailroom had now become something else. It had transformed, transubstantiated into a skylit hearth. The floor, 11 acres of Quaker gray Tennessee marble, shone like a frozen puddle. Walnut benches gleamed in varnish. High-definition departure screens lent sans serif dignity to Ronkonkoma locals. A three-dimensional clock dangled down with the weight of a cast-iron radiator. Escalators treaded away to trains. This is me on a weekday in June 2021 in the teeth of the pandemic. And as you can see, there's virtually nobody in the station. So this is recent history, but looking at this picture, it's certainly history from the perspective of today. Inside Moynihan, 4 glass catenary vaults span everything. Their panes, thick at the edges, ever more diaphanous toward their peaks, make inverse congruence with the trolley wires strung in the basement. The glass hopscotches across 3 gray trusses, stout enough to hold up the Tenderloin sky. After decades under styrofoam, passengers can see clouds and the blue between them. On New Year's morning, 2021, some people came by just to watch the sun rise in quiet effulgence, welcome peace after the loudest of years. Masks muffled what needed saying. Rubber-soled sneakers cheap-chooped over the stone floor. Of course it's a nice day, Daniel Patrick Moynihan liked to say. It's the only one we've been given. Born in Tulsa, raised in Manhattan, Moynihan polished shoes in the old Penn Station. He entered City College of New York, then the Navy, then Tufts University, the London School of Economics, and inevitably, politics. Moynihan's famously bipartisan career included stints in the Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford administrations. Senator Moynihan cast progressive votes against Cold War defense spending, welfare cuts, and the Defense of Marriage Act. He also railed against universal health care. In 1978, Moynihan sponsored a law to revive Washington's Union Station, about which I talk about in another part of the book. In 1991, he agitated for money to repaint Hellgate Bridge. Late in life, Moynihan mused to whomever would listen about the outsized and underused James Farley Post Office on 8th Avenue. The firm of McKim, Mead, and White had designed this limestone sanctum to complement their adjacent Pennsylvania station. Farley perched on pillars over the tracks in what one astounded journalist called a chunk of space in the air. The building facade still bears the postal creed. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Why, Moynihan asked, could this handsome building not become a new Penn Station? It took 30 years and 4 master designs before Moynihan Train Hall welcomed passengers. The senator died 17 years before a surgical masked Andrew Cuomo cut the ribbon. The glossy hall, packed with public art and an upscale food court, heads a reef of midtown development. Moynihan sits across 9th Avenue from Manhattan West, a high-rise project that opened above the corridor tracks in 2021, complete with skating rink, Whole Foods, Peloton shop, and for a period, a fiberglass lemon grove. West of Manhattan West is Hudson Yards, another prefab habitat for the ultra-affluent, spun from the air over trains. Beside Hudson Yards runs the High Line, a ribbon park fashioned from an abandoned freight railroad through Chelsea. Moynihan Hall promised amends for Penn Station's mutilation, but could only dispense clemency. Most passengers still use the old Penn Station, squalidly interred beneath Madison Square Garden, including all New Jersey Transit patrons and many Amtrak and Long Island Railroad riders who exit trains in the direction of subways. Moynihan Hall has, in my opinion, too little seating, and the bathrooms are too far from the concourse. The tracks are buried so deep under the marble floor that you can barely hear the engine bells over the din of another Manhattan emporium. Vice magazine journalist Aaron Gordon called Moynihan an office building that happens to have a train hall in it. For a time, no one wanted to seem dumb for liking it. But I like it. Even commercialized, insufficient, Moynihan waved a signal flare of optimism in the gloom of pandemic winter, extending a stone-wrought vow that people would again convene in metropolitan palaces to travel between great cities. The hall dignified New York, even as half its job was to remove people from Manhattan. Architecture critic Michael Kimmelman wrote that in the midst of everything else, we need this. New York needs this. Well, the Northeast does too. Moynihan constituted a kickoff, a commencement, a down payment toward more work on the railroad. Like a switch, the sunny atrium routed past and potential on their respective courses through a region that blooms from the compost of history. Moments into service, Moynihan was already a classic. After 200 years, the train line was making the Northeast again. The corridor was still arriving. Thank you. If you'd like to learn more about the book or potentially purchase it, I'll drop some links in the chat. But thank you again for giving me the opportunity to talk with you all tonight. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Dave.
Very
Yes.
nice.
That was outstanding.
Really outstanding. Yes.
Fascinating. Look.
You took things a lot farther than most people do.
Yes, that's true.
It was excellent.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I always feel, I wrote this for a more generalized audience, so I'm sure that a lot of this a good bit of this would be old hat for people who know, who really know the story, but I appreciate getting to share it with you.
One question that I had, can you hear me? And one question that I had was when you talked about the steamer Maryland and how it sank in the Harlem River, and did the passengers get out or did they drown?
They escaped
They
because
did
a conductor ran along.
All of them?
All of them.
Amazing.
They pulled them out of coaches, and some of them were in sleeping berths inside of train cars on top of the Maryland.
Yeah, you said that they woke them up, and I was saying, did they all get out?
They all got out, and as soon as they pulled away the fire hoses, their connection continued on to Boston. They were late, but they made it there that night.
It was more
It's a different
fortunate.
day. Different ideas of trauma, I think.
They did much better than the passengers on the General Slocum.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Remember
German
that one.
American
That's a
immigrant.
famous one.
So
They
my
didn't figure it
big
out.
question is, since you wrote this great book, it appears, and you know your story and seems to have your ducks in a row. My question is are you interested in taking your opportunity, saying goes, to open up your shirt on your own and see where you want to go with Penn Station?
Mm.
Like, sorry, what do you mean? Oh, like give my own opinion?
It's future. Where do you want to go?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's hard to imagine. I mean, some of the early plans, involve so much office space that now seems pretty anachronistic and outdated with the pandemic. I would love to see an open hall terminal. I would love to. You have to make such an effort when you get off a train. I usually wind up on NJT coming into Penn Station and then walking back all the way to go up into Moynihan Train Hall. I would love to see something more. It's just so locked down with the family that owns the Knicks, the Dolman family, and the whole. There's a long New York Magazine piece about it, and it's kind of hard to imagine. But I think of some of the terminals in London that are really efficient and open air, and much more hospitable, that feel like things that could happen.
How
But
about operational? Do you know how the train runs underneath and how that works?
Well, I mean, I think
Familiar with
that,
the railroad operations?
oh, I mean, right. I mean, that's also, I mean, that's the other thing where people talk about the kind of cultural and the, the architectural improvement of Moynihan Train Hall. And of course, they're still stuck with 2 tracks under the Hudson River. Yeah, I'd like to see much greater capacity
Well, there
under the
will be more
river.
under the Hudson River. Yes, that's true.
The Hudson River, and of course, I think the new Gateway Bridge over the Hackensack is really just as crucial for getting traffic into, and that looks to be about half done. The last time I rode by it about a month ago, and I've heard that they've been making pretty good progress. It certainly looks like it. So won't have to hold our breath when we go over the old Bessemer Bridge.
Well, all right, as you go in your merry way, I'll impart a couple of points. Number one, his successors may have a word with you. It's very common. The former president of Pennsylvania Railroad, his name was what? Your favorite president, I'm sure, because he built Penn Station, was what?
Well, I mean, I've heard both Cassett and Cassat, and I was
Cassett. It's Cassett.
so
No doubt
I was
about it.
just at the
It was
Railroad
his
Museum.
his sister in Paris changed her name from Cassett to Cassette.
Okay, I'm happy to go back. I was just having this conversation with the head of the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, and he told me Cassat and actually pointed me to that statue that I showed. But what you say kind of makes sense. I could totally see Barry putting on airs in France and sounding it out like Cassat. I don't really have a horse in that race, but thank you.
Okay, that's minor stuff, really, but something I just, as I say, you go about the world, just bear that in mind.
No, thank you.
Okay, the other thing is, as far as Penn Station goes, when it was designed, okay, it was sort of a geographic accident why the terminal was located where it was on both sides of Manhattan. Okay, what was already there on one side and kind of where it could go on the other side, and that's what they created. It was known as the Meadows Division. Pennsylvania Railroad called it the Meadows Division. That's what they coined it. Okay. It was a new railroad that had to get built to connect to the rest of the railroad down at Manhattan Transfer, as you know. Okay. Anyway, that remains its Achilles heel. It will, no matter what they do to redevelop the terminal, they're going to be stuck with the same constraints, no matter what they do. And the only way the railroad is going to work right is when it only can go from New Jersey to Queens in a timely fashion. Okay. And the way the real estate is in Manhattan, the way the expansion plans have developed, they got it. Last I saw, they were talking about at one time as many as 8 stub tracks from the New Jersey side. Okay, it's a built-in bottleneck that simply won't work.
Yeah, and so many of those NJT trains go to Queens. They just don't carry passengers.
You can build what you want in what's called Penn Station South. Okay, they can build it if they want, fine. But if they do, it won't really work unless you find a way to expend those trains all the way over to Queens. And I don't even think that's in the plan.
Wow.
So there's a lot of inherent trouble. Okay. Now the biggest thing with the Moynihan, and I think I heard, as I understood it, it was sort of considered to be somewhat less than successful, they thought.
I think it's a mixed bag. I've heard a ton of criticism. It's just such an improvement that
I think what they hoped somehow it was going to take the heat off of what was left of the existing Penn Station, which has been called down and nothing else now for what, 60 years? As a dump, basically. Okay.
Okay.
Anyway, so they were hoping that Moynihan would sort of take the heat off of that, and it really didn't, because everybody, as you say, they're going to the Rangers. You know, they're going to the garden, they're going to an office,
That's the problem.
they're going shopping
Mhm.
over
Yeah.
Okay,
Macy's, they're going all over the place, okay?
Yeah.
They're going to get buses now. There's a lot of bus passengers that go and come from Penn Station, not into the terminal, but around it. All kinds of
Oh, yeah.
Megabus or Bolt bus, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
okay, we have some
Discount
other
bus.
commenters.
why do they always keep funneling into the same few entrances, all the same old escalators, to the same old collector areas, like the big, what used to be the concourse, what's left of the concourse. And it's like,
Makes you wonder.
Oh, okay,
and that's probably one of the few places I can think of that now looks almost the same after the pandemic as it did before.
oh,
In all of
Okay.
America, I mean. Okay. Anyway, okay. Very simple reason it did not, and I really don't see how it ever will, unless there's another way to do it.
okay,
Very simply, the 8th Avenue subway is in the way.
Mm,
Very simple.
Oh,
Okay,
Yeah,
now a
okay,
little bit.
we
when
have
they're-
some other commenters.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'll
Okay.
shut up in a minute. Just to
Okay,
let them
just a
know.
minute.
One last thing, when they were constructed, they did have the foresight to put the shelves for subways under 7th and 8th Avenue during the
Mhm.
construction of Penn Station itself. So those were already built.
Okay,
Where the subways, they weren't built till 1932 in one case.
oh, the IND.
The shell was built in 1906 and 07 and so forth. Okay. And this is, some of the problems it has that may never be able to fix. With that, I wish you good night. Thank you very much.
okay.
Thank you.
Great job.
All right, let's hear from Greg. Come on.
Bye-bye.
yeah.
And-
Hi, thanks so much for a great talk. Sorry, I was a
Yes, it
little
was.
late, but yeah, I heard most of it and I enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
It was very
Yeah,
good.
I heard that comment about the Penn Station South idea. Yeah, I always there's a lot of community opposition to that because of the historical architecture, but I always wonder why they don't, and I don't know if anybody here can even answer that. If they want to expand more tracks, why don't they use the Grand Central Madison approach and go deep cavern,
Mm.
but I do know that there's a water tunnel under 6th Avenue, under the 6th Avenue line. So, you got to be careful of that if you want to
Yeah.
extend it at all. But
Maybe
that's just
that's
my
why
thoughts.
they can't.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, yes, all right.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Greg. All right, Alan, you're next.
Yes, well, David, I want to thank you for an excellent, excellent presentation. It really, you
agree.
really
He was.
covered
Yeah.
it, amazingly well. I mean, really, your thoughts and your expression just really, made the history come to life and really kind of takes us from the past, the present, and get us looking into the future. I mean, your impression about the new Moynihan Hall, really, it's very enlightening. And just as other members of our group here have said, well, it may not be perfect. It's definitely better than, what we had. I mean,
Yes.
far better than, than going into that cavern, low ceiling with the obstructed beams. I remember my first introduction to Penn Station was around 1969 when my sister spent a couple of years out at Hofstra University, and I'd take the train, the Long
Oh,
Island Railroad out to Hempstead, and having to go down into that basement
yeah.
cavern. I mean, oh my gosh. But looking at the Moynihan Hall, at least now they've got some semblance of what the
Yeah.
original Penn Station was, with the open art steel beamed skylight ceiling. It's a start. The only thing is, I said, some people have said many of the trains, I guess, I don't know, you still have to use the old Penn Station, and the distance, I guess, from the tracks to the hall, it's quite a commute. But again, people were saying the same thing about Madison Station and Grand Central, that too was quite a trek to get, from point A to point B, or heaven forbid, point C, 15 to 20 minutes of walking. That's the whole thing. I guess, just as you were saying, all the infrastructure was put in, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, and we got to work with it, and it's not easy. But I think what they did, I think, is a significant improvement, and at least it's here it is 60 years later, it shows that people do care now about the past and the preservation effort, whereas in the early 1960s, they didn't.
They really need more places where you can sit
Thanks,
down.
Alan.
Yes,
know,
there
Yeah,
are.
if you're going first class, you can go to the first class lounge upstairs, but down on the main floor, you would think that they could have at least a few benches, even
Yeah,
if they have to
that's
kick
for
the
sure.
homeless people
They-
off of the-
You have homeless there.
But
It's a
that's
serious-
what I was gonna
Oh.
say. I noticed benches
That's a
and
shame.
trash cans,
Mm.
things like that have been eliminated from a lot of
removed.
public places
Mhm.
because the problem, I guess, with
Yes.
the homeless and vagrants. But what some places have done, in lieu of a wide open bench, they kind of have them broken up into cubicles where you
Ah,
have,
yes, yeah,
instead of a 6 foot long bench, you may have 3 or even 4.
yeah, with the partitions between
partitions, so
Yes.
them, yes.
they can't lay
Correct.
across it.
There's a
But
really
still nowhere to sit.
there's
I
a
noticed that.
really wonderful short story by William Faulkner called Pennsylvania Station, and it's a conversation
Oh.
between two homeless men in the 1940s or 1950s, talking about how long they could stay at Penn Station before they were kicked out. And then they could go to Grand Central, and how long they could stay there and hopefully remain until sunrise. And he has
I'll
this
have to
line
look at
about they brought inside with them the smell of snow, which I always thought about. I was thinking about that with Moynihan Hall. Like, something I often tell students in the English department is when they're writing papers and essays, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Mm,
And I
like,
think that is just
definitely.
so much of the corridors. Incremental improvements are really important. I think
I
the
agree.
new
I
Acela 2
agree.
train, Avelio, when it gets into service, is not going to be high-speed rail to Shanghai. It's not going to be Spain's Ave train, but it'll be better. It'll have higher capacity. It'll accelerate quicker. Schedules will be I think
Yeah,
those marginal improvements are really important. And
Yeah, I
one
would
of
say,
the,
for sure.
I think-
Incrementally.
one of the things one of my reasons in writing this book is that I know a lot of people who are urbanists who really want more public transit. They love trains. They love the environmental efficiency of trains. They love urban lifestyles. They don't want to drive cars. And yet they have like no operational idea at all of how a railroad works. So they'll say, we need a high-speed rail to Montreal, and we'll get there in 2 hours, and one to Chicago. And they're not thinking about right-of-way acquisition or all of the concerns that you raised about
so
what
many
a
concerns.
South Penn Station would be. So in
True.
my mind, I'm hoping the book can put some of those people in conversation with rail professionals, people who worked in the industry, people in the rail heritage community who know what they're talking about, so that we could come
Yeah,
up
then
with
realism.
something better than we have now, and
Yeah.
something that's not a complete fantasy either.
Right.
The fact that we have, in this country, there's just lower density than in other places, like the Northeast Corridor. I'm not sure, just
Yeah.
like you can have high-speed rail, maybe in pilot projects, Brightliner, maybe what they have in Florida.
Mm,
We'll have to see what between LA and Las Vegas, how well that, how
next
much
one.
ridership we get there before you could just have a high speed, just a rail across the country. The
Brightliner.
best distances, it's not Europe.
Yeah, outside of a few corridors, I mean,
Right,
you
right.
could imagine one in parts of California, Southern California. I mean, and you see how in a fairly densely populated area like Florida, I mean, all of the
Yes.
operational troubles that Brightline has. I mean, the auto fatality and pedestrian trespasser
yeah.
strike
I've heard
fatality
something
is
about it.
horrific.
Oh, my God.
On Brightliner in Florida, are there actually just grade crossings that come down?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or some there aren't.
They
And
don't
you
have
have people
crossing
who have been
gates.
you have people who have been driving in that area their whole life who are used to lumbering freights, and they're not expecting a 110
Yeah.
mile an hour, semi-high speed diesel train to come through. And so, I mean, I think you're starting to see some of those issues. And then, you have the California project, which, I mean, I hope that comes to some
Hope it
workable
does.
form. It's just such a massive investment, and it's such a,
Yes, and
it'll
I
be a
have lot
thing
of
we'll be
questions.
arguing against forever and advocating rail if it doesn't work. But
yeah, rather than take just sides, I'd like to find out just terms of, for it to be successful, what would it be when it's finally completed, if it's completed, what would it be competing against in terms of LA to San Francisco travel, other than car, bus, and
Coast Starlight.
and is
Airplane.
it, yes, will the
Even
Coast
airplane.
Starlight that now runs still run?
That's 13 hours though.
Oh, my God.
yeah,
13
I've been on that.
hours.
It's very beautiful, but it's
It's
very,
beautiful, but
very
long.
inefficient.
Yes, and will it, according to the plans, will it still be running once that's
Sure, it's a
complete?
luxury train. It's
Oh, that's good.
maybe. That's right.
Yeah,
And then
well, it
there's
runs
still
all the
some-
way to Seattle, the coast.
Yeah,
Oh, it
yeah,
does,
it
yeah.
goes-
Yeah.
It's a sightseeing train,
It
Right.
is, right, so it's a site, maybe they'll keep it.
They're not gonna
And
discontinue
there's some
that.
local Amtrak service, some regular Amtrak service that runs through the Central Valley, I think a part of it.
Mhm.
Does it
San Joaquin.
between
San
Bakersfield
Joaquin's.
and Merced?
Yeah, right.
So
Yeah,
I'm
that
not sure
Amtrak?
if that'll be replaced.
I'm
Well,
trying
we
to.
definitely need service in the east of
Oh, yeah, we
Los
do,
Angeles.
yes.
That's what's
Oh,
lacking now.
they have a bunch of commuter
Palmdale,
rail, but it's not
Victorville.
great.
Yeah. Like
I was
something
out there
that's
for a
being,
week and it's not great.
see, San Diego Light
It's not
Rail is
Metro North.
expanded to the east.
Yeah. I'm trying
Well,
to
I want to
find,
thank David once again. I urge everyone to buy the book.
Yes,
Please send us the link for the 30% discount if you order it from Chicago
yes, and
University
emailing would
Press.
be best. I mean, I'll say
It's,
the,
I just put it in the chat, but you know what? I'll just
Thanks.
drop it
You know-
into an email responding to your,
Thank you.
there it is. I just sent that off, and I'm
Oh,
just
great.
actually, yeah.
okay, good.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome, David.
Yes.
Have
All
a
right,
good weekend.
have a
Yes,
good
you
weekend.
too.
Yes,
Enjoy the
thank you very much.
weekend,
Thank
and
you.
Have a great
Okay,
weekend. Thank
so-
you.
Hey,
have a
bye.
good night. Bye,
Good
all.
night.
Good night.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you so much,
Bye,
Dave.
everyone.
Have a good time.
Yeah.
Yes. Night.
Good night.